My parents told me, sign over your house to save your brother's business or you're no son of ours. I refused and left. Years later, they returned demanding a share, but I had already found something in Dad's safe. I was standing in my parents' kitchen when my father slid a stack of papers across the table and told me that signing my house over was the only way I could prove I was still part of the family. I had driven over after work because my mother had called me 3 times during the afternoon and said something serious had happened with my younger brother, Ryan. I assumed somebody was sick. That was honestly where my mind went first. My parents were both in their late 60s, and my mother had been having some health problems that year, so when she sounded frightened on the phone, I left work early and drove straight over. Instead, I found Ryan sitting at the kitchen table with my father. There were folders everywhere. There was a calculator beside my father's coffee. There were several envelopes from banks and one thick envelope from an attorney's office. Ryan looked exhausted. My father looked angry. My mother looked like she had been crying. I remember standing there for a few seconds with my coat still on because nothing about the scene made sense. Ryan owned a small contracting company. He had started it about 6 years earlier, doing residential remodeling and eventually taking on larger renovation jobs. For a while, it seemed like he was doing extremely well. He had a couple of trucks, several employees, and enough work that he was always complaining about how busy he was. I had never been involved with the company. I worked a regular office job, lived fairly quietly, and had bought my house several years earlier. The house was not huge. It was a 3-bedroom house in an ordinary neighborhood with a mortgage, a small backyard, an aging furnace, and a garage that was permanently filled with tools and boxes. But it was mine. I had bought it after saving for years. My name was on the mortgage. My name was on the deed. I had spent weekends painting rooms and replacing old fixtures because I couldn't afford to hire people for everything. I was still paying the mortgage every month. At the time, I owed somewhere around $118,000. The house was worth considerably more than that, but it wasn't some mansion sitting on millions of dollars. It was just the biggest thing I owned. My father finally explained what had happened. Ryan's company was in serious financial trouble, not temporarily short on cash, not waiting on one client to pay an invoice. Seriously in trouble. He had taken out several business loans, used credit cards to cover payroll, personally guaranteed equipment financing, and apparently fallen behind on taxes. One large project had gone badly. Then another client had disputed an invoice. Then materials had become more expensive. Then one of his biggest customers had delayed payment. Ryan had kept borrowing to stay afloat. By the time I learned any of this, the company was apparently close to collapse. The amount my father mentioned made my stomach drop. It was more than $200,000. I remember asking why a business with that much debt needed my house. My father explained that a lender was willing to restructure some of Ryan's obligations if the family could provide additional collateral. My house was the easiest option. That was the phrase he used. The easiest option. I thought he was joking. He wasn't. My mother had apparently spent the previous week trying to convince Ryan that I would help. She told me they believed I could refinance the house, take out the equity, and put the money into the business. Then my father pushed the paperwork toward me. It wasn't even just a loan against the house. The documents were for transferring ownership. The explanation was that the lender wanted clear control over the property if the business failed. I remember reading the first page 3 times. I wasn't a lawyer, but I wasn't stupid either. The paperwork made it clear that I would be giving up my ownership interest. My father said it was temporary. He said Ryan would repay everything once the company recovered. I asked why the lender needed ownership instead of a normal home equity loan. My father became irritated. He said I was making things unnecessarily complicated. I asked how much Ryan owed in total. Nobody answered immediately. That silence bothered me more than the number. I looked at Ryan. He was staring at the table. I asked him if he knew exactly how much debt he had. He admitted he didn't. That was the first moment when I realized this was much worse than my parents had made it sound. My mother started crying again. She said Ryan had made mistakes, but he was trying to save the business and keep his employees from losing their jobs. I understood that. I didn't want anybody to lose their job. I also understood that a failing business didn't magically become safe because I gave up my home. I told them I couldn't sign anything that day. My father stood up. He was furious. He said I had always been selfish. He reminded me of every time my parents had helped me when I was younger. He brought up college. He brought up the used car they had helped me buy. He brought up Christmas gifts. He brought up the time my father had spent an entire weekend helping me repair a fence. I didn't deny any of that. I told him I appreciated everything they had done, but none of those things meant I owed them my house. That was when my father said something I never forgot. He said that if I refused to sign, I was no son of theirs. I didn't argue. I looked at the papers one more time, then I stood up. My mother begged me to stay. Ryan didn't say anything. My father told me I would regret walking out. I told them I hoped Ryan's business could be saved, but I wasn't going to transfer my home to solve a problem I didn't create. Then I left. I drove home in silence. I remember sitting in my driveway for almost 10 minutes before going inside. The house suddenly felt different. It was the same house I had lived in for years. Same furniture. Same kitchen. Same stack of mail on the counter. Same ridiculous dent in the garage door from when I backed into it. But for the first time, I understood how easily someone else could decide that something I had spent years building belonged to the family simply because they needed it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking maybe I had overreacted. Maybe my parents were right. Maybe family really was supposed to help each other no matter what. Maybe refusing made me selfish. Around 2 in the morning, I got a text from Ryan. He didn't insult me. He didn't threaten me. He simply said that he understood why I was hesitant, and that he wished I would reconsider. That somehow made me feel worse. The next morning, I called a real estate attorney I found through a coworker's recommendation. I explained the situation without exaggerating anything. I told him exactly what my father wanted me to sign. He advised me not to sign anything. He also suggested that I pull copies of my deed, mortgage records, and property tax records and keep them somewhere secure. I did that during my lunch break. That was the first practical step I took. I didn't know it at the time, but it would matter years later. The attorney also told me something else. He said that if my family wanted to help Ryan's business, there were dozens of ways to structure assistance that didn't involve giving away my house. The fact that they had immediately focused on transferring ownership was concerning. He couldn't tell me what their motives were. Neither could I. But I stopped assuming. They were simply desperate parents trying to help their son. The next few months, my relationship with my family basically disappeared. My mother called occasionally. Sometimes she cried. Sometimes she sounded angry. Sometimes she said Ryan was doing better and that I should stop being stubborn. My father didn't call me at all. Ryan eventually filed paperwork to shut down the company. There were creditors involved. Employees were laid off. Some equipment was sold. I learned about most of it through my mother. Ryan had apparently tried to negotiate with several creditors, but there was too much debt. The business closed. I felt terrible for him. I also felt relieved that I hadn't given up my house. That relief made me feel guilty. I kept thinking that maybe if I had helped, things would have ended differently. Then I received a letter from a collection agency addressed to Ryan at my parents' house. It wasn't my debt. It wasn't connected to my mortgage. But my mother had accidentally sent me a picture of it while asking me if I knew anything about the creditor. The amount was much higher than what my father had originally told me. That was when I realized they hadn't told me the whole story. I asked my mother about it. She said the number included penalties and other obligations. I asked how much Ryan had owed before the company closed. She stopped responding. A week later, I got a phone call from my father. It was the first time he had spoken to me since the kitchen incident. He didn't apologize. He told me that Ryan's company had failed because I had refused to help. I didn't know how to respond to that. I told him that I wasn't responsible for a business I didn't own. He said I was his son and should have acted like it. Then he hung up. I spent the rest of that day angry, not explosive angry, just tired angry. I went to work. I answered emails. I bought groceries. I paid my mortgage. I came home and mowed the lawn. Life continued. That was probably the strangest part. The family crisis had felt like the biggest thing in the world, but outside my parents' house, nothing had changed. My boss still wanted reports. The grocery store still had long checkout lines. The water bill still showed up. The mortgage still came out of my account every month. Slowly, I rebuilt some distance. About a year later, my mother invited me to Thanksgiving. I almost didn't go. Eventually, I decided that avoiding every family gathering forever wasn't how I wanted to live. I drove over with a pie. Ryan was there. My father barely acknowledged me. Dinner was uncomfortable. Nobody mentioned the house. Nobody mentioned the business. For a while, I thought maybe everyone had decided to move on. Then Ryan asked me how the house was doing. I said it was fine. He said he had heard I had been renovating the basement. I told him I had replaced some drywall and installed shelving. He smiled and said it was probably worth a lot more now. I remember feeling a small knot form in my stomach. I didn't respond. Later that night, my mother apologized for how everything had happened. She said my father had been under enormous pressure. She said Ryan had been desperate. She said nobody intended to hurt me. I accepted the apology. At least I thought I did. I didn't fully trust them anymore, but I wanted to believe the worst was behind us. For several years, things stayed mostly quiet. I never transferred the house. I never lent Ryan money. I didn't become involved in his next business ventures. He eventually got a job working for another contractor and seemed to stabilize his life. My parents got older. Their health became more complicated. I helped when I could. I drove my mother to appointments a few times. I helped my father replace a water heater. I brought groceries when they were sick. I wasn't punishing them. I simply kept financial boundaries. Then my father died. He had a heart attack early one morning. My mother called me from the hospital. I drove there immediately. Ryan arrived later. The next several weeks were a blur. There was a funeral. There were insurance forms. There were bills. There were conversations with the funeral home and paperwork from the hospital. My mother was devastated. Whatever anger existed between my father and me became much less important. He was still my father. I loved him. That made everything more complicated. After the funeral, my mother asked me to help clean out some of his things. My father had always kept paperwork. He had file cabinets filled with old tax returns, mortgage documents, insurance policies, receipts, and manuals for appliances we hadn't owned in 20 years. He also had a large metal safe in the basement. I had known about the safe my entire life. As a kid, I assumed it contained money. My father never let me near it. After he died, my mother said she didn't know the combination. That didn't surprise me. My father had been extremely private about finances. We eventually found the combination written inside an old address book. The safe contained several envelopes. There were passports. There were old savings bonds. There were insurance policies. There were copies of wills. There were property records. There was also a small locked document box. My mother told me to leave it alone. She said my father had always kept certain papers private. I respected that, at least initially. A few weeks later, my mother asked me to help sort documents for probate. That's when I opened the document box. I wasn't looking for anything related to myself. I was trying to find information about a life insurance policy. Instead, I found a folder with my name on it. I remember staring at it for a long time. The folder was old. The paper inside had yellowed around the edges. The first document was a copy of my mortgage closing statement from when I bought my house. I didn't understand why my father had it. Then I found a handwritten note. It was in my father's handwriting. The note wasn't addressed to me. It was apparently written to my mother. It explained that my father had helped me buy the house by giving me money for the down payment. That part was true. I had always known he contributed some money. What I didn't know was that he had also kept copies of several documents connected to the transaction. There was another folder underneath. That one contained bank statements. I recognized my father's account numbers. Then I saw something that made me stop. The down payment money hadn't come entirely from my father. A large portion had come from a joint account my father and mother held. That still wasn't surprising. What surprised me was the date. The transfer had happened several months before I bought the house. The money had been moved into my account in 2 separate payments. I had assumed my parents were giving me a gift. The records suggested something else. There was a handwritten notation beside one of the transfers. It said that the money was connected to a family trust. I had never heard of a family trust. I kept reading. There were documents I didn't understand. One appeared to be an old estate planning document. Another referenced a property my grandparents had owned. My father had received some money after my grandfather died. I knew that. What I didn't know was that part of the inheritance had been placed into an account that eventually contributed to my down payment. That changed the way I understood my house. I had always considered it completely mine, but I had never realized that the money used to help me buy it had been connected to inherited family assets. I started wondering whether my parents had considered the house part of some informal family arrangement. That would have explained why they felt entitled to ask for it. But it didn't explain what I found next. Buried behind the estate documents was a photocopy of a document from an attorney. It was an old agreement between my father and Ryan. The agreement had been signed years before Ryan started his contracting company. I read it twice, then a third time. My father had loaned Ryan money to start the business. That wasn't shocking. The shocking part was the collateral. Ryan had pledged his business assets and a portion of his future proceeds as security for the loan. My father had also included language saying that any additional money he provided to Ryan would be treated as a loan unless explicitly documented otherwise. I sat on the basement floor holding those papers. For years, my parents had told me that I was selfish for not sacrificing my house to save Ryan. But my father had apparently already protected himself when he invested in Ryan's business. He hadn't simply given Ryan money. He had documented the arrangement, and then I found something even stranger. There was a copy of a spreadsheet. It listed money my father had given Ryan over several years. The total was enormous. It wasn't just the original startup money. There were additional transfers for equipment. There were payments toward credit cards. There were checks written directly to suppliers. There were payments toward payroll. The amounts added up to more than $300,000. I felt sick, not because I thought Ryan had stolen it. It looked like my father had willingly given him the money. But then I found another document. It was a note from my father explaining that Ryan had promised to repay everything after selling the business. That sale never happened. Instead, Ryan had kept borrowing. I started seeing the whole family history differently. My parents hadn't been asking me to rescue Ryan from one bad year. They had spent years trying to rescue him. They had repeatedly poured money into his business. At some point, they had run out of easy money. My house had become the next available asset. Then I found the thing that changed everything. At the very bottom of the box was a sealed envelope. My father's name was written on the front. Inside was a letter from an attorney dated several years earlier. It concerned my parents' estate plan. I read it slowly. My father had created an updated will after Ryan's business had started receiving substantial financial help. The will stated that certain assets would be divided between me and Ryan, but it specifically excluded any debts owed by Ryan from being treated as gifts. In other words, money my father had loaned Ryan was supposed to be counted when the estate was settled. Ryan wasn't simply getting an equal share after receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars during my father's lifetime. The loans were supposed to be accounted for. Then I found a second document. It was a signed acknowledgement from Ryan confirming that he understood the money he had received from my father was not automatically a gift. I recognized Ryan's signature. I knew his handwriting. I had seen him sign documents before. I sat there for a long time. The whole thing suddenly made sense. My father had been angry at me because I refused to take responsibility for Ryan's debts. But at the same time, my father had documented that Ryan's financial problems were his own responsibility. I didn't know what to do with that information. I didn't want to use my father's private papers against my brother. I also didn't want my mother to be financially harmed, so I called the attorney handling the estate. I brought copies of the documents. He told me not to make accusations. He reviewed everything carefully. He explained that some of the documents would need to be verified and that the estate would have to follow the actual will and applicable probate rules. He also told me something that surprised me. The old loan agreement could potentially matter. If the debt was enforceable and had not been forgiven, it might be considered an asset of the estate. That meant Ryan could actually owe the estate money. I asked what would happen if Ryan denied the debt. The attorney said that was exactly why documentation mattered. I gave him every copy I had found. Then I told him I didn't want revenge. I just wanted the estate handled correctly. My mother was informed. She was furious at first. She accused me of trying to take money away from Ryan. I told her I wasn't asking for anything. I was asking everyone to follow the documents. She said my father had always intended to help Ryan. I said I believed that. I also said helping somebody didn't necessarily mean pretending the money never existed. Ryan reacted badly. He said the documents were old. He said my father had told him many of the loans would eventually be forgiven. I told him I didn't know whether that was true. If Dad had forgiven the loans, there should be paperwork showing that. That was the position I took. I wasn't accusing Ryan of lying. I wasn't calling him a thief. I wasn't threatening him. I simply refused to argue about something that could be determined by documents. That was when the family conflict became ugly again. Ryan told our mother that I had been waiting years for Dad to die so I could take his money. That hurt more than I expected. I hadn't thought about inheritance. I didn't want my father's money. I wanted the house I had paid for. I wanted my parents' estate handled honestly, and I wanted to stop being treated like the family emergency fund. The probate process dragged on. There were forms, there were creditor notices, there were account statements, there were tax issues. There were several meetings with the attorney. During that time, I learned that my father's financial records were even more complicated than I had realized. He had kept careful records of every major transfer to Ryan. Some were clearly labeled loans, some were gifts, some were ambiguous. The attorney separated them. The documented loans were the important part. Ryan eventually hired his own attorney. That made everything slower. For several months, nobody in the family spoke to me except my mother. Then one evening, I got an unexpected call from Ryan. He sounded different. He wasn't angry. He was tired. He admitted that he had not remembered some of the documents. He said he had been so overwhelmed when the business collapsed that he stopped looking at paperwork. He also admitted that Dad had warned him for years that the money couldn't continue forever. That conversation changed how I saw Ryan. I still felt betrayed, but I also realized he wasn't some mastermind who had planned everything. He had gotten in over his head. My father had kept bailing him out. My mother had defended him. Ryan had started believing that another rescue would always appear. Then I had been asked to become the final rescue. I told Ryan I didn't hate him. I told him I wished he had asked me for help before everything got so bad. He said he had been embarrassed. I understood that. I had been embarrassed too. I had been embarrassed that my own family had demanded my house. I had been embarrassed that I had almost convinced myself I was a bad son for saying no. I had been embarrassed that it took me years to realize how much of the family dynamic revolved around Ryan's problems. The estate eventually settled. The documented loans were treated as debts owed to the estate. Some of the money was recovered from assets that remained. Other amounts were negotiated. Nobody became rich. There was no dramatic courtroom scene. There was no judge banging a gavel while my brother confessed. There was no movie-style revenge. There was paperwork. There were meetings. There were signatures. There were uncomfortable phone calls. And eventually there was a final accounting. My mother received what she was legally entitled to. I received my share. Ryan received his share after the applicable debts and adjustments were accounted for. It wasn't the giant inheritance people imagine when they hear a story like this. The most valuable thing I walked away with was probably the knowledge that I had been right not to sign over my house. But the story didn't end there. About 6 months after probate closed, my mother called me. She said she wanted to talk about the house. I immediately felt that old knot in my stomach. She explained that she and Ryan had been discussing Dad's estate. She said they believed I had benefited more than Ryan because I still had my house. I reminded her that I had bought the house. She said Dad had helped me with the down payment. I reminded her that the estate documents showed where that money came from. She said she wasn't asking for the whole house. She said she thought Ryan deserved some kind of share because the family had invested so much in me and him. I told her I wasn't going to give away part of my home. She became emotional. She said Dad would have wanted the family to share. I asked her whether she remembered the night they asked me to sign the house over. She said she remembered. I asked whether she remembered Dad telling me I was no son of his if I refused. She said she regretted that. That was the first time she actually admitted it. I told her I regretted it too. I regretted that I had spent so much time believing their anger meant I had done something wrong. She started crying. I didn't know how to comfort her. Eventually, she told me that she had been afraid. She said my father had convinced her that Ryan's business could be saved if I cooperated. She said she had trusted Dad's judgment. I told her I understood. I didn't excuse it, but I understood. That was probably the closest thing we had to an honest conversation in years. After that, our relationship slowly changed. It didn't become perfect. There were still awkward family gatherings. There were still subjects we avoided. Ryan and I weren't suddenly best friends, but something fundamental had changed. Nobody could use the house as leverage anymore. The documents had settled that question. A couple of years later, Ryan started a much smaller business. He worked alone at first. He leased equipment instead of buying everything. He kept separate business accounts. He hired an accountant. He stopped borrowing from family. I was genuinely proud of him for that. He asked me once if I would invest. I told him no. He laughed. I think he expected that answer. Instead, I helped him review a budget. That was the kind of help I was comfortable giving. Advice. Time. A second set of eyes. Not my house. Not my retirement account. Not my financial future. My mother eventually moved into a smaller place. She couldn't maintain the old house after Dad died. The sale was complicated because of the estate process, but eventually it went through. I helped her pack. While we were cleaning the basement, I found the old metal safe again. It was empty. My mother had already removed everything important. I asked her what she thought about the documents I had found inside. She sat down on an old folding chair. She said my father had been obsessed with protecting the family financially. At the same time, he had been terrible at setting boundaries with Ryan. She said Dad believed that if he gave Ryan enough chances, Ryan would eventually succeed. She said that by the time they asked me for the house, Dad was desperate. I told her I understood desperation. I just didn't think desperation gave somebody the right to transfer someone else's property. She nodded. Then she apologized. Not for the first time, but this time it felt different. There was no request attached to the apology. She wasn't asking me for anything. She wasn't asking me to forgive Ryan. She wasn't asking me to sell the house. She was simply acknowledging what had happened. I accepted it. I still think about that night in the kitchen sometimes. It has been years. The house is worth more now. My mortgage balance is much lower. I've replaced the furnace. I finally fixed the garage door. I planted a tree in the backyard that is now taller than the roof. None of those things are particularly impressive. But every time I make another mortgage payment, I remember how close I came to giving away something I had worked for because I was afraid of being called selfish. The thing in my father's safe didn't magically save me. The safe didn't contain some secret fortune. It didn't contain a dramatic confession. It contained paperwork. That was it. Paperwork my father had apparently kept because he was the kind of person who saved everything. But those documents showed me something I had been unable to see when I was standing in that kitchen years earlier. My family had been operating on 2 different sets of rules. When Ryan needed help, family meant forgiveness, flexibility, and endless second chances. When I said no, family suddenly meant obligation. When Ryan failed, everyone looked for reasons to explain it. When I protected myself, everyone looked for reasons to blame me. I don't think my parents woke up one morning and decided to treat me unfairly. I think it happened gradually. Ryan needed help with one thing, then another, then another. My parents kept solving the immediate problem instead of dealing with the larger one. Eventually, the cost of solving Ryan's problems became too large, and because I had a stable job, a house, and decent credit, I became the obvious person to ask. Maybe they genuinely believed I could afford it. Maybe they believed family should share everything. Maybe they thought I would eventually give in because I loved them. They were wrong. The most important thing I learned was that saying no doesn't automatically mean you don't care. Sometimes saying no is the only responsible thing you can do. I could care about my brother without becoming responsible for his business debt. I could love my parents without signing away my home. I could feel sorry for someone's situation without agreeing to make it my situation. I also learned that staying calm mattered more than I realized. If I had screamed that night, thrown the papers across the room, or threatened my father, the family would have remembered my behavior instead of the documents. Instead, I left. I got legal advice. I kept records. I paid my bills. I didn't post anything online. I didn't tell coworkers. I didn't try to embarrass my brother. I didn't threaten my parents with the documents in the safe. I simply waited until the truth needed to be addressed. That made the eventual outcome much less dramatic than people might expect. There was no revenge. There was no moment where I stood in front of everyone and announced that I had won. Honestly, I don't think I won. I think I avoided losing. There is a difference. My brother lost his first business. My father died without seeing his family fully reconcile. My mother had to live with the knowledge that she had helped pressure one son to sacrifice something for another. I lost years of closeness with my parents. Those aren't victories, they are consequences. What I gained was the ability to stop carrying guilt that never belonged to me. Ryan and I still talk, not every week, sometimes not for months, but when we do, it feels more normal than it used to. He has told me more than once that he is grateful I didn't sign the house over. The first time he said that, I was surprised. He explained that if I had done it, the business probably still would have failed. He said he had looked at the numbers afterward and realized the debt was too deep. My house would have disappeared into the same hole. He said that knowing this made him ashamed of what he had asked me to do. I told him I was ashamed too. He asked why. I told him because I had spent so much time believing that protecting myself meant I was hurting him. He said that was how our family had always worked. Nobody laughed. There wasn't much else to say. My mother still lives nearby. We have lunch sometimes. She asks about the house. I tell her the same boring things. The roof needs work. The backyard needs mowing. The property taxes went up. The furnace is behaving. Normal stuff. She seems to like hearing about it. Maybe because the house represents something different to her now. Not an asset that could have saved Ryan. Not something my father could use to solve a problem. Just my home. One of the last things I found in the safe was a photograph of my father standing in front of the house shortly after I bought it. I didn't remember the picture being taken. He was holding a small paintbrush because he had helped me paint the living room that weekend. I kept the photograph. For a long time, I didn't know whether I should. After everything that happened, I had complicated feelings about him. I was angry at him. I missed him. I understood some of his choices. I disagreed with others. I loved him. I still do. People sometimes act like love and anger can't exist at the same time. They can. My father was not a monster. He was a flawed man who made some very bad financial decisions and allowed his fear for one child to override his judgment about another. My mother wasn't a monster either. She was afraid of losing her family and made choices that hurt me. Ryan wasn't a monster. He was a man who made terrible business decisions and became dependent on people rescuing him, and I wasn't some perfect hero. I almost signed. That's the part I don't usually tell people. I spent that entire first night thinking about signing. I actually considered calling my father the next morning and agreeing. I imagined how relieved everyone would be. I imagined Ryan's business surviving. I imagined my parents being proud of me again. I imagined myself taking another mortgage against the house later and rebuilding. The only reason I didn't do it was because something about the paperwork bothered me. The transfer was too permanent. The promises were too vague. The debt was too unclear, so I paused. That pause changed my life. I think about that whenever someone tells me that being patient is passive. Sometimes patience is the most active thing you can do. You don't react. You don't make the decision while everyone else is emotional. You gather facts. You read the paperwork. You ask someone qualified. You sleep on it. You let people reveal what they actually mean. And eventually, either the situation becomes clearer or it doesn't. In my case, it became very clear. Years later, when my mother and Ryan came back asking for a share of my house, I didn't have to scream. I didn't have to threaten them. I didn't have to prove I was a good son. I had the deed. I had the mortgage. I had the payment history. I had the property records. And thanks to a box my father had hidden in an old safe, I finally understood the financial history behind everything that had happened. The documents didn't make me more important than my brother. They didn't make me better than my parents. They simply made it impossible to rewrite what had happened. My house had never been a family emergency fund. It had been my home. And the day I finally understood that, I stopped feeling guilty for protecting it. I still wish things had happened differently. I wish my father had talked to me instead of threatening me. I wish my mother had stood up for both of us instead of trying to keep the peace. I wish Ryan had asked for help before the debt became overwhelming. I wish I had recognized the favoritism sooner. But I can't change any of that. What I can do is make sure I never again confuse love with surrender. I can help people without handing them control over my life. I can forgive someone without giving them access to my finances. And I can walk away from a family argument without needing the last word. Sometimes the facts really do speak for themselves. In my case, they were sitting in a metal safe in my father's basement, waiting for someone to finally open the box.